Starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining our ILEX webinar. I'm Corinne Bonevite from the marketing team here at ILEX Group in London. Today on the West Lead Trainer, will take us through why best practice in project management is not enough. But before that, a few tips to ease your journey through this session. On the right-hand side of your screen in the control panel, you will see the question section. You can ask your question throughout the session, and Andy will answer those questions at the end of the webinar. You can also tweet them using the ILEX webinar hashtag. So type them in. We're eager to provide you the answer you are looking for. We have two upcoming events. One webinar in November, on November 10 and 11, on how to implement Brexit changes effectively. You have in the control panel, you have the link if you wish to register to this two-session of webinar. We will also be exhibiting at Project Challenge in Olympia on October 11 and October 12. It's a good opportunity to come and meet us at Stand 80. If you want to stay informed of our upcoming events, you can also follow us on your preferred social media platform, Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. This webinar is recorded and you will receive the replay by email. Last but not least, we love to hear your feedback, so please take a couple of minutes to fill the survey at the end of this session. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Andy West. Over to you.
Thank you, Corinne. Hello, everybody. As the slide says, I'm Andy West. I'm a senior training consultant here at ILEX. I cover primarily project and change management skills. I've been involved in projects for quite a long time. Even before I was a trainer and I worked for ILEX, I was involved in projects. In fact, prior to joining ILEX, I was head of management development at a water company, a utility, and the last project I was involved with was actually implementing a structured project management method across the organization. And so this is kind of where this particular webinar has come from. The purpose of the webinar is to consider the difficulties embedding and using Prince2 in organizations. Now, we're using Prince2, the project management methodology, as an example of a best practice method. You might also apply exactly the same sorts of things I'm going to talk about to MSP, Managing Successful Programs, or MOP, Management Portfolios, or any of the other best practice methodologies that you may consider. We'll have a look at some of the reasons for the lack of success in embedding and tailoring Prince2 specifically, and suggest some strategies that might actually improve success of using these sorts of best practice methodologies within an organization. As I say, I'm going to use Prince2 as an example. I'm going to focus on projects, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about will be equally applicable to other best practice methods. So, before I get into the difficulty of embedding it, just to set the scene. So what is Prince2? It's an acronym, of course. It stands for Projects in Controlled Environments. 2. What does it try to do? Well, it's a project management method. What it gives you is an integrated structure that allows you to manage any project of any size in any environment from start through to finish. It's made up of 4 elements: principles, themes, processes, and tailoring. The principles are the basic best practice idea. Guiding obligations. In fact, if the 7 principles are true of your project, you are in fact running a Prince2 project, even if you didn't think you were. The 7 themes, it says here, the raw materials, the basic tools. Again, if you've run projects in any environment, you will have found that you're probably dealing with some, if not all, of those 7 themes. The 7 processes is the route map. How do I get to the start and finish of a project? And I'll pick up tailoring in a second. The 7 principles, these are best practice ideals. These are the basic obligations for good project management. So, for example, in terms of the 7 principles, we have continued justification. Is there a good reason for doing this project? And if not, well, then we probably shouldn't be doing it. Leads into things like the business case. Learn from experience. Are we doing continuous improvement through the life of our project? Are we looking at what we're doing and improving what we're doing, and are we sharing that knowledge with our colleagues to ensure that all projects are getting better as we go through. Define roles and responsibilities. Because a project is a temporary structure, do people understand where they fit, what they're responsible for, who they report to, what they're accountable for, those sorts of things. Manage by stages. Break a project into manageable chunks. Now in Prince 2, the smallest project is 2 stages, an initiation stage, essentially a planning stage, and then everything else. But it could be as many stages as you need. Next principle is manage by exception. Now this is actually quite an important one. This is about the appropriate use of expensive resources. We, in projects, always need a project owner. Now Prince 2 will call that an executive, and they're part of a project board. You may call them a project sponsor or a senior responsible owner, and they're part of a steering group or a steering committee. But we have an ownership team. Now those are expensive people, expensive resources. We don't want them managing the day-to-day. So they need to delegate not just the task of delivering the project, the stages, but also some authority to do so. And as long as we're within that authority limit, then you need routine reporting. It's when we go outside of that, then we actually have to escalate the exception to the next higher authority. Similarly, as a project manager, you will delegate work to your team managers, your technical people, and you should delegate them some authority. You would want them to deal with the day-to-day small problems. It's only when they can't deal with those, or it's a bigger problem, that they should be escalating to you. So management by exception allows us to delegate work and authority for the work. Therefore, we have a way of controlling both routine work, routine reporting, and the non-routine, the exception process. The 6th principle is focus on the product. What Prince 2 talks about is focusing on the final output. Is it clearly defined? Do we know what we're doing? And therefore, do we have a clear end to the project? And the simple thought process here is, if we know what we're supposed to be doing, it's much easier to work out, have we done it? If we start a project without a clearly defined endpoint, it's often just going to carry on, and therefore focus on product gives us this clear endpoint. The 7th principle is a repeat. It's tailored to suit the project environment. One of the things here, Prince 2 is designed for any output, any size, and any environment. Therefore, to make Prince 2 work, you have to tailor it. How big is this project? How mature is the organization? How mature is the team? How complex is the project? How big is the project? All of these sorts of things. And so the important point here is we're not trying to use all of Prince 2 all of the time. It's about using it appropriately. And this is where we start to get the difficulties embedding and using Prince 2 appropriately. As I said, the 7 themes, basic toolkit, the process model, the route map. Where are you in the project? What do you do? And where do you go next? And importantly, in Prince 2, the process map allows us to link the principles, themes, and documentation. Where am I in the project? What do I do? What documents do I use to record where I'm at the moment and where I'm going next? So it starts to give us that kind of thought process to bring all these things together so we can actually understand where we are in a project. You can apply that to everything. Now, what does Prince 2 not try and cover? What Prince 2 doesn't try and cover is things like, well, what are you delivering? Where do you work? So you can use Prince 2 for IT projects, construction projects, finance projects, organizational development things. And you have to add those specialist aspects to make sense of it. Similarly, within Prince 2, there's no defined set of techniques. There are lots and lots of good techniques across project management. So things like the investment appraisal techniques, the planning techniques, network diagrams, Gantt charts, risk identification techniques, risk evaluation techniques, and so on. Now what Prince 2 actually says is we are going to provide a basic framework, and we'll suggest 2 techniques which we think are important. However, as you're going through the Prince 2 model, you may need to add specific techniques and choose certain techniques which suit your project in your environment. And therefore, Prince 2 doesn't cover everything. It doesn't try to. The final thing that Prince 2 doesn't cover is leadership or people skills. So it kind of says things in the manual like, if you submit this to your project board, then they will approve it. Of course, we all know that in real organizations, it depends on sometimes how you present things to your project board, your senior management, about whether they'll approve them or not. So it doesn't do leadership, it doesn't do teamwork or conflict management, negotiation, communication skills. you have to add those to make Prince2 work. So the analogy that I like to think of, and I say that I do think in pictures for these sorts of things, is that if your project is a vehicle that you're trying to move, essentially Prince2 provides an engine block, a way of driving that project forward. However, engine blocks require fuel and lubrication. The specialist aspects, the techniques, the leadership, the people skills become the fuel and lubrication. Without those things, Prince2 will seize up. It will not move forward because it hasn't got all the things it needs. What it's trying to do is provide at an organizational level, in lots of ways, a best practice model. Here are the things in experience that all projects need. These are the core skills, the core themes, the core principles. If you look at something like the body of knowledge, so for example the Project Management Institute and here in the UK the Association for Project Management have their body of knowledge. Both of those try and cover everything a project manager might need, and they include things like leadership, the techniques, not the specialist aspects. You still have to bring those in yourselves. So if we look beyond Prince2, there's lots of other things that other best practice guidance actually tries to bring in and say, we need to have a look at these sorts of things as well. Now, some of those will be appropriate for some of your projects, and some of them may not be. But it's important we understand those. But in the body of knowledge, for example, it says that as part of initiating risk, you should produce a risk management plan. What it doesn't tell you is what should be in a risk management plan. Prince2 is much more prescriptive. It says if you're going to define risk, you should write what's called a risk management strategy to define your procedures, and the risk management strategy should contain these sorts of sections, and this is the sort of information that goes in there. So it's much more prescriptive than, say, the body of knowledge. It gives you things you should do, a set of documents, a set of templates that you can actually start to use within your organization. For those of you who are not familiar with our website, ilxgroup.com, in fact we have a download section. If you look at the Prince2 section on there, you can download a set of templates from Prince2 that cover standard use within a project. The other thing that Prince2 does provide guidance on, and it links back to the idea of tailoring. Prince2 is a model, a framework. It's not a straitjacket. What you need to do is work out how to use it. And so the Prince2 model provides some guidance on embedding and tailoring. And we use these two different phrases. Embedding is about the organization adopting Prince2 as a corporate standard, about deciding that as an organization we're going to use Prince2, and therefore trying to define, well, how are we going to use it? What are we going to call it? How much of Prince2 are we going to use? Are we going to use the documents as they are? Are we going to change the documents? Do we add our logo? Do we integrate some of the documentation? How do we integrate it with our current business processes? And of course, if you're embedding it as an organizational standard, who's going to own it? Who's going to make sure that people are using it appropriately? And what do we mean by appropriately? And how do we make sure that they're going to use it? So what training development is needed, and what tools do we wish to put in place to assist the use of those? So embedding essentially is that kind of adoption process. Tailoring is then project focused. How do I make this model work for this particular project? Now, clearly if your organization has embedded Prince2, then you'd set to tailor it to the use of a particular project. But it may well be there's an organization you don't want to go for the organizational focus, but as a project manager you're going to use Prince2. You should still tailor. How much of the themes do I need? How much risk management or business case or planning is actually needed? Do I want to adjust the specific terms or language to suit the people in my particular project and their understanding? Can I clearly define what it is I'm going to create in terms of the documentation? Have I adjusted the role descriptions to suit how many people I have in the team and who's doing what? And can I make sure that the process model is appropriate? And this is where our difficulty starts. And there's two sets of difficulties essentially. One, embedding. How do we as an organization actually embed Prince2? And secondly then, tailoring. How do I make it work once I am using Prince2 on this particular project? So what we're going to have a look at this afternoon essentially is both embedding and tailoring. But we'll look at them in turn so we can try and consider the sorts of things that go on. Starting with embedding then. As an organization, you make the decision, we're going to embed Prince2, we're going to adopt Prince2 as a corporate standard. And you launch this, and one of the first things you hear is, I've heard of Prince2, Oh, that's hugely bureaucratic. Have you seen the size of the manual? Oh, we shouldn't be using all of that sort of thing. And here we have one of the first things about Prince2. Prince2 actually says we should tailor the use of Prince2. It should not be a bureaucratic process. And in fact, one of the basic rules of Prince2 is it's a control system. And if you have a light, simple project which is low risk, you don't need much control, and therefore how much you use of Prince2 should be reduced. So often what happens is that people are using it inappropriately, too much. And the problem comes with when you look at the manual. The manual's been written for the biggest circumstance, for the biggest projects. It covers, if you're working on a huge project, you need to do all of these things. What you need to be able to do is embed the core. What is it that we have to do for our smallest projects? And therefore we can start to look at how we might look at those sorts of things. So the first thing we have to get past is people's opinion of it being bureaucratic. And if I give you a real example, when I worked for the water company I did, we embedded Prince2, and our engineering team actually was ISO 9001 accredited. And part of ISO 9001 covers design, development, implementation, and then operations and maintenance. So it covers projects. So to fit Prince2 in the engineering team into their ISO 9001 rules, we have to update 9001, our internal processes, to reflect that we're using Prince2. Now, unfortunately, they gave the Prince2 manual to somebody who A, didn't understand projects, and B, didn't understand Prince2. And actually, they wrote the whole of the Prince2 manual into the corporate processes, which actually meant that for the smallest project, you had to use everything in Prince2. Unsurprisingly then, about a year later, when I trained the quality manager who owned the ISO 9001 rules within the engineering team, and I, at the start of the course, asked for their objectives, his comment was to understand Prince2 so I can destroy it from the inside, which is an interesting start to a Prince2 course. And as we went through, he started to understand it actually wasn't Prince2 that was enforcing we had to do all these things. It was how it had been adopted within the organization. And so actually what he went back to do was went back and rewrote the internal processes as a minimum standard with guidance on how to do things if it gets bigger. And I'll pick that up as we start to look at the strategies. So you can see there, these are one of the common kind of miscomprehensions about Prince2, but how it actually comes about, how people start to believe those sorts of things. The second one is kind of a different environment. People who don't like rules, people who don't want to feel constrained within a set of rules and processes. I have to say that in my experience of being a training consultant, this phrase has most commonly come when we're dealing with creative organizations, so advertising, marketing, design organizations, where they need to be innovative, they need to be looking at doing something different, something new. And of course, what we're not trying to do is constrain that part of their life and that part of their work. What we are trying to do with Prince2 is actually have a control system in place so we understand what they're doing and how they're going to work. And so it's about separating those two things. The third biggest problem I've seen or encountered when we're dealing with people embedding Prince2 is the baby out with the bathwater syndrome, where organizations decide we're going to adopt Prince2 and they throw away everything they currently have. And what we're doing, of course, is throwing away their best practice, the things they're good at, with the things they want to get rid of. And so what we need to do when we look at embedding is to try and retain the things we want to nurture, keep the baby, just get rid of the things that we're not particularly keen on, the bathwater. And this kind of reflects into the last bullet point on here. Prince2 as a methodology, as a structure, has a language. And this language is often quite different to what everybody uses in their business as usual, in what the language they've already used in projects. And therefore, there's a kind of resistance of, I don't know what you're talking about. If we can actually minimize that, then we can start to do something about it. So these are the kind of embedding difficulties. These are the things that kind of get in the way of dealing with the change from going not using Prince2 to using Prince2. I'll look at some of the kind of strategies we might use for doing this in a bit. In terms of tailoring, the sorts of things to consider here is well, what's a big project? What's a small project? How do I decide? And do I just look at how many days it is or how big the budget is, or do I have to bring in risk into this? I mean, if it's a highly risk project, do I want more control? And therefore, how do I judge, if it's risky but small, how much of Prince2 do I use? What techniques should I use? What other things that aren't part of Prince2 should I add this time around? And of course, one of the things here is, where do I find out how to do this? And so tailoring becomes kind of, I'm not sure how to do this. Where's the right place? Where do I go for advice? If we look at the sorts of things that come out as results of this, the sorts of things you might notice in your organization. We do lots of training. Lots of people have been on training courses. We've all got the Prince2 badges or the MSP badges, depending on the subject we're talking about. But if you look in the office, if you look at the projects, if you look at the programs, there's little actual use of those things we spent lots of money and time training people on. And so one of the things we have to consider is, how do I actually apply these things? How do I enable my people to use it? The disaffected staff is people who have learned Prince2 or MSP and are now trying to use it, but they don't have the support or the commitment of others in their organization. I want to do this and I'm passing this report on, but the people I'm talking to either A, don't understand how I'm doing it or why I'm talking about these things, or don't want to do those. One of the most common things we see here comes from senior management, because if you want to change how you do projects, this is a change in the organization. This needs an owner, a project executive, a project sponsor, somebody who's going to commit and support this change to make it happen. And so the reality here is, if you want to adopt Prince2 and change how you manage projects, it's not enough to train your project staff. You also have to train and educate your senior management, the rest of the organization. Do we understand what this paperwork is, what this language is, how we're going to do it? If not, then the project manager may try to implement things which everybody rejects. I don't want to do that, which can come back to, I've heard this bureaucratic and therefore I don't want to play along. The third bullet point here is the kind of poor control, which is, because we haven't adopted the best practice model, we don't have appropriate control mechanisms in place. And therefore, to give our senior management confidence in what's going on, they have to get more involved in projects. One of the classic symptoms of this is the project review day, the monthly project review day, where the project manager walks in with every piece of information about the project and goes through it line by line. And the senior management's role is to try and pick holes in what's going on and ask lots of very awkward, very, very detailed questions about things that often they don't know about or don't need to know about. For this kind of event, it takes a couple of days to get ready for it and a couple of days to recover afterwards. And therefore you're losing a chunk of your month to this report. And what we have here essentially is senior management being involved at an inappropriate level, essentially micromanaging. So we're going to consider how we might try to deal with those sorts of things. My last bullet point here, I have to say, I have in fact borrowed from the Prince2 manual. It talks about this. Heroic project management is where we leap into a project with little planning, little documentation, little control systems, and essentially we run from crisis to a crisis, solving the crisis, looking like the hero as I slay dragon after dragon. It looks incredibly impressive, but it's very stressful, and it does mean that the project isn't progressing smoothly. It's lurching from one crisis to another, and the hero comes in to resolve those sorts of things. The far end of the scale is robotic project management, where somebody looks at Prince2 and says, I'll use all of it. And rather than thinking about, is it really necessary, it just applies everything. One of the common drivers of this, if you like, robotic project management is a blame culture. If people want to avoid a blame culture, if they do everything that's in the process, everything that's in the manual, then they can't be accused of it being their fault because they did everything by the book. And what they're not doing is taking any risks. What they're not doing is actually managing appropriately. They're essentially hiding behind the documentation. And those are kind of extremes of a kind of scale of project management. And what we're suggesting by appropriately using best practice models is something in the middle, something that allows people to use the model in an appropriate way for small projects, for large projects. So, some things to think about. How can we do this? How could we take this forward? First thing, some embedding strategies. And the simple one is probably obvious, but I'm going to say anyway. This is a change to your organization, implemented as a project, which means you need an executive, a project board. You need to engage the appropriate stakeholders. You need to have that commitment. When we did this in the water company where I worked, the reason that we had a drive for this, and we had 200 to 300 project managers, people running projects, all of whom had their own process and their own language and their own paperwork. And therefore, as senior managers, the senior managers are receiving lots and lots of different bits of paper, probably telling them the same thing, but it's almost impossible to integrate the information and understand it as a whole because it's coming through in lots of different formats. And so, essentially, there's a business driver that says, can we just have one bit of paper that I can understand that tells me what's going on? Can I just have one format for the plans, for the reports, to see what's going on? And of course, in a project, what it allows us to do is to use Prince2 and show people how it works, and therefore they can start to see as an example. And that links into the second one, the business reasons. What's the value in doing this? Why are we doing it? What are we trying to improve? So things like improve communication. Because we all use the same documentation, does it mean that people can find the information much quicker? Does it mean that you get better commitment, quicker decision making, because people can now see why you're doing it? Does it make staff more flexible? Can you move people from project to project because now you have a consistent method? They can see what paperwork is going on. They can understand the language going into this. And by having business reasons for doing it, this becomes a good project to do. So it comes back to the first principle in Prince2. Continued business justification. Is there a good business reason for doing this? Now, in the water company where I worked, standardization, consistency, better communication, staff flexibility were all the sorts of general reasons we talked about. One of the other things that we found at that time, and this is a statistic from about 17 years ago now, so hopefully this is much better. At that point in the UK, 20% of projects didn't have a business case. So potentially 20% of projects were a waste of time and money. Now we only spent £300 million a year on projects as a business, but that is potentially £60 million being spent doing the wrong things. And as all organisations do not have unlimited resources, this piqued the attention of our finance team and said, actually, a control system that validates that this is worthwhile is a very useful thing for us. There is a good business driver for doing this, as well as standardization and consistency. It gives us control over where are we spending our money, which is kind of important for all organizations. The third point, retain the current language. This is a particular point that I think is crucial. Language in organizations has grown up through your culture. You call things what you do because this is what's always been called in the organization. If you adopt Prince2 and it has an alien language, this becomes a resistance point. You're not talking the same language as me. This also comes down to things like documentation. If you have some existing documentation, then why not keep the title? Why not just change the content? This way, what you're actually starting to do is essentially introduction by stealth. What you do is you take the current document and you improve it using the best practice model. If you want a good example of this, we were working with an organization, and at the start of the project you produce something called the high-level terms of reference, the HL TOR. Brilliant. In Prince2's term, this is what's called a project brief. In their high-level terms of reference, it missed a number of important things. Constraints. What limits are there on this particular project? Risks. What uncertainty is there? And oddly, benefits wasn't documented particularly well, as are most of the elements of the outline business case that Prince2 would include. And so, rather than change the title, what they did was they added a couple of extra sections to their high-level terms of reference. And suddenly project managers going, this is actually really useful. This is things I can see. And this extra section suddenly meant I understood what I've got to plan around. And what we're doing there is we're keeping the baby. We're nurturing what we're good at already. And what we're doing is to get rid of the things that aren't helping us the bathwater. And this way, people start to see what's going on. Now, this links into John Cotter. John Cotter looked at effective change in organizations. And one of his principles is, in his 8 principles for this, is to look for quick wins. And a quick win like this of, it's the same document, it's just a better version of the document, means that people want to use it. They will then ask you for, have you got any other things we should add? Have you thought about improving these sorts of things? And that way, people start to accept that it's useful. They don't notice it's a big change, it's just improving what they do. The keep it simple idea is important because not all of your projects are big projects. And what we need to be clear on is, when do I want a small amount of Prince2? One of the common things that we often pick up when we're running Prince2 and other sorts of training courses is we don't use Prince2, we use Prince2 Lite. And as a project manager, as a project trainer, my answer is excellent. That's exactly what you should be doing. Because for small projects, that's what you need. It's for bigger projects that you start to approach using more things or maybe even everything out of the Prince2 manual. It's trying to decide how much of this is actually here. So as an organization, what you should do is embed it at a small level and give guidance on how to add more. That way, people know that they can start with the small, and that's sufficient to run small projects. And therefore, they then start to hopefully use more as you go through. Now, this starts to link into the be wary of formal standards. If you have things like ISO 9000 or any other kind of business standards you adhere to, if you documented a big scale piece of Prince2 into those standards, then you have to follow it for all projects. It's much better to document the minimum and then allow people to add more. There is a slight constraint on this, and I have bumped into this into a number of organizations where if you don't tell people that they can add more, they can add these things, then they don't. They always only ever do the minimum, even if what they're doing requires a great deal more work. There's actually an example of this from the Prince environment. Prince2 was actually developed and launched in 1996. It was development of Prince, which was launched in 1989. Now, Prince as the first model was basically just the themes, but not even all of them, because when Prince was first written, there was a separate standard called PRAM, Project Risk Assessment Method. And the people writing Prince went, well, PRAM's already existent, they're already using that, therefore we don't need to define Prince2. It defined risk in Prince. They will just pick up PRAM and carry on using it. And the people who are using Prince look and says, oh, it doesn't say risk. We don't have to do risk management. So Prince2, when it was launched, bolted in Prince into risk management and said, you must do risk management as part of these sorts of things. And what we have here is we're having to add things to our standards because people are not essentially adding things when they need to. They're looking at the mirror and going, oh, that's all I'm going to do. The idea of standards is we should be planning for the smart, giving people who are going to use their intelligence to use them in an appropriate way. And if it's minimum, that's all they use. If it's bigger, they start them and they add other things as well. What we often end up doing is legislating for the stupid, for the people who go, well, it doesn't say I've got to do it, well, I'm not going to do it. And we put more things into our standards than we actually need because we have these people in place. Now, there is a way of dealing with those, which I'm going to deal with in a second. The last thing there about keeping it simple is, well, Prince2 has a lot of documentation. We know this. There are 24 different templates you could use in Prince2. Keep it simple says, for smaller projects, do I need to use all of that documentation? Rather than having lots of separate documents, can I actually combine them? We work with the telecommunications organization. It's 11 years ago now. And when they launched their version of Prince2, this embedding project, they had 2 versions of the documentation. They had a comprehensive version and a concise version. The comprehensive version was for big projects. And essentially, if you look at the project initiation documentation, each document, each heading in there is a separate document. And the PID, the project initiation document, is just the folder you keep it in. The concise one, the PID, the project initiation document, is a single document. It's 3 sides long. Essentially, all the things you need to define the project are on those 3 sides, apart from you have to add a Gantt chart from Microsoft project. So to define a small project, it was 3 sides of A4, not all of them completely filled in, and a diagram. And when it was launched, the project managers looked at it and went, you know, people might actually read this. It's not too big. It's appropriate for small projects. But what you need here is how to decide. Is this a small project, concise paperwork, or a big project? And one of the things that's talked about in the Prince 2 manual, in the section on embedding and tailoring, it talks about scales of project, and it talks about tasks, small projects, medium projects, large daunting projects and programs, and therefore how much Prince 2 should be applied to that sort of project. A rough set of guidance. One of the things I would suggest here is if you're going to deliver Prince 2 as a model in your organization, you need your own version of this scaling tool, a way of deciding how big this project is, and therefore how much Prince 2, how much project management you wish to apply to it. How big should the team be? How big should the project board be? And so on. A few years ago, I was working with a council in North Wales who had a wonderful version of this. It was called their Project Assessment Matrix, the PAM. And essentially, the first side was 6 or 8 questions. I can't remember them entirely. As it was their copyright, I wasn't allowed to keep a copy of it afterwards. But it had 6 or 8 questions. So things like, how much risk is there in this project? So very little, a bit. How long will this project be? How much will it cost? How many of our strategic objectives does it support? None, 1, 2, all of them. If it went wrong, how bad is the impact on public relations and reputation of the council? And there are always 4 answers, 4 options. It's a standard questionnaire, and you score 2 marks, 4 marks, 8 marks, or 16 marks, depending on where you ticked. And the idea is at the very start of the project, the executive, the sponsor, and the project manager will go through and tick an appropriate box in each of these areas. Where do we feel it is for each of those? And at the bottom, very simply said, if you score between 0 and 55, it's a small project. 55 to 100 is a large project, is a medium project, and above 100 is a large project. And then when you turned it over, the way of keeping it simple, it said, right, for a small project, you must use this documentation. We'd recommend you use this, and you could use this if you wanted to. For a medium project, it was a longer list of must and a longer list of requirement, and so on. Importantly, you had to use the musts. For the recommended, if you decided not to use it, you had to explain. So you could actually not use some of the paperwork, but you had to explain why you were not using it. For the desirable, you have to explain why you were using it. So therefore, encourage you to not use all of those things for small projects. As you went to a bigger and bigger project, the list of desirable things became smaller, the list of things you must use became larger. But it gave them a way of adjusting how much they're going to do on this. And as a last thought on this is sometimes people don't like the full formal process. What they want is something they can understand for the smallest projects. Working with the council in London, with the London Borough, they have a very simple project life cycle. It's a pyramid. At the bottom, it says plan. In the middle, it says do. At the top, it says review. It's still a project life cycle, but it's a simplified one for small projects. And within plan, it talks about some of the Prince 2 elements that you can do in terms of project brief and project initiation documentation. In terms of do, it talks about things about work packages, delegating work and control systems. And review, it's about closing a project, handover and implementation. So it actually has, underpinning it, lots of the Prince 2 things. But it's simplified so people can understand for smallest projects, I'm going to plan it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to review what I've done, which of course enables people to use it much quicker. Linking this into tailoring then, how do I make this work for individual projects? Well, there is some Prince 2 guidance. So there is some things in there that you can actually use in Prince 2, some things from that particular chapter saying, well, how much shall I use? One of the things about this is assessment. Have I missed anything? Is there anything I could do better? And one of the things here, again in the Prince 2 manual, is a checklist. So it's a simple check. As I'm setting up a project, I can look at those sorts of things and yes or no, have I done it? Is it appropriate? And one of the things here is a role in projects called project assurance. The purpose of project assurance is to keep an eye on the project on behalf of the owners, the executive, the project board. The important thing is they're independent of the project manager. And therefore, before the project manager submits things to the project board, it may well be important that somebody else has checked it and gone, is this appropriate? Are they going to approve it? And this is often a way of dealing with the heroic project manager Because if the project manager says, I've got this rough sketch and I'm going to leap into the project, assurance can start asking you questions about, well, what are you going to do if? What about risk? And what about change control? And therefore, what we start to do is we start to prompt them to think about how to answer those sorts of questions. And so using the structure appropriately, using project assurance, allows the board to be confident that what's being delivered to them is something they're going to approve, they're going to sign off. Their decision-making is much more improved. Project assurance is a role within projects which I personally believe and I observe is not used as much as we could do. And therefore, senior management end up micromanaging because they need to retain control. If we want to manage by exception, essentially, to step back, then it starts to look at, can I get somebody else to do an independent check? Can I get somebody to check those figures so that when the project manager walks in and presents something and says, I need such and such money for the next stage, my independent body can go, we've checked their estimates. Those estimates are actually based on some kind of reality. It's worthwhile carrying on. At that point, the senior manager can make a decision much quicker without having to go through everything line by line. So this becomes an important tool. And the third one here is we can only tailor appropriately if we learn from experience and if we share that knowledge. So part of the role of assurance is not to check and tell you you've done it wrong. It provides guidance on how much might be appropriate. So they become a knowledge source. That says at the end of a project, do we evaluate? Do we share that information? Are our assurance people part of that particular process to actually help make sure that we're sharing the experience, the scalability, the use of Prince2 across our organization? The second part of that, of course, is essentially, do we have a network, a community of project managers? Are we willing to share? One of the most difficult barriers here is knowledge is power. If we have a culture where knowledge is power, no one will share their experience because if I know more than you, I'm more important than you. Really what happens here is power is knowledge shared. If we can actually share our knowledge across the organization, then as an organization we get better. We don't all have to make the same mistakes. We can learn from each other's, which as an organization is a much healthier place to be. But it's about those sorts of things. There's a question come through that says, like the idea of the tool to scale project sizes, where can I find a tool like this? One of the things, if you have a look in the Prince2 manual, in chapter 19, there is a section about scaling projects, and it gives a rough guide of the table. One of the things to consider is the sorts of things that make projects big or small more difficult in your environment. So things like, if it goes wrong, the impact on public relations, how many of your strategies to support, how risky is this? So are you doing something hugely innovative or something where it's a known solution in the past? How long is it? How much money is it going to cost? How much resource must you put in? Are you using external suppliers? So if you use those sorts of things as a kind of rough checklist, those 7 things to think about there, what you start to look at is, well, how do I grade those in our organization? It's again, it's an experiential thing. Knowledge. If you've got project managers who've run these sorts of projects, they can start to tell you, using one supplier, using all internal people is less risky than using one. Using 2 or more is better. Using 6 or 7 is horrible. And suddenly we have a way of grading those and scoring them, and therefore we could build a scoring system. The most effective ones here are about organization. How do we do it around here? What works for us as an organization? So our tailoring strategies are all about trying to make sure that we share this so that we can all do it better. And therefore the evaluation at the end of the project becomes kind of crucial. So the thought about this is that when we look at putting in a best practice model, I'm using Prince2 as an example. Prince2 isn't project management, and project management isn't just Prince2. You've got to add a lot of other things. And a big chunk of this is a common sense application, things that help me decide how much of this I actually need. This is about organizational experience. This is about organizational knowledge. And if we can do that, then we can kind of plan for the smart rather than legislate for the stupid. To make this sort of change work, what I need is senior management support. I need my senior managers to go, we want a control system, but we don't want to be managing in detail. We don't want to be micromanaging. What tools can we use? And if your senior managers and your project managers understand the framework that you want to use and understand it together, it becomes much, much more effective. So there's your kind of thought process going into this. So I leave you with the kind of thought there. Every project is unique, and therefore how you deal with it, how you manage a project should be unique. The idea of Prince2, of any of the best practice models, is to provide a framework. It's how do I apply that framework appropriately. And if I can do that, I can work effectively. One of the things I suggest to project managers when I'm training them is Prince2 is a control system. And so there's a kind of balance here between control and bureaucracy. I want enough Prince2 to give me control of my project without adding too much to make it bureaucratic. And there's your balance. In a second, I'm going to ask you for questions. What I'm just going to do is run through a couple of courses and some contact details should you wish to talk to us about projects, talk to us after this particular webinar. But if you'd like to think about questions whilst I'm roughly going these slides, you can kind of let these go on in the background whilst you're thinking of awkward questions to ask us. So, essentially, a word from our sponsors. If you're going to look at these sorts of things, I've been talking about Prince2 today, which is a framework, a best practice methodology for projects. If you're going to look at things like programs, then it will be something like MSP, Managing Successful Programs. If you're looking at portfolios, the collection of all of this work, again, Management Portfolios is available as well. The Program and Project Sponsorship course is aimed at senior management. This course is aimed at providing an overview of the sponsorship role so they understand what they need to commit to, what they need to understand, without drilling down to all the management detail of a project or a program. So it provides a useful way of essentially upskilling your senior management. The third one on there, the APM Project Management Qualification, essentially is the broader syllabus. I mentioned it at the start of the talk, the start of the webinar. A body of knowledge covers everything a project manager might need. So the APM Project Management Qualification is far broader than Prince2. It covers the same things as Prince2, but then adds in things like leadership, the soft skills, teamwork, the techniques, the other things you need to add to Prince2 to make it work. So it provides a broader syllabus. So Prince2 provides a framework for your organization in lots of ways, and the APM Project Management Qualification provides a framework for your career development as a project manager. And finally, change management. I'd recommend this to all project and program managers that are listening. Change management looks at people's attitudes to change, models of change within an organization, and focuses on stakeholder engagement and communication. How can I get my community, my stakeholders, on side? So when I launch an output from a project, it turns into a capability and turns into an outcome. It is a way then of actually making sure I've understood what's going on and I'm doing it in the best way possible. So thank you for listening to those. So in terms of that, if you wish to contact us, here's our contact details. Primary one, our website, ilexgroup.com. If you're in the UK and Europe, then our number here, you can contact us directly on here, and the people at the end will get hold of you. So it's +44 01270 611 600. Two individuals there. If you're doing individuals, you're looking for training for yourself. If you talk to Nadia, if you look at corporate inquiries, training for your organisation, if you talk to Paula, both of those will try and help you. If you're in Australia, if you contact Cheryl on the number shown there, then she'll be help you with those sorts of inquiries in there. So in terms of questions, I'm getting a few through, so I'm just having a look at what I've got. The first one says, do I have to be Prince2 qualified to be an effective project manager? And the simple answer is no. Effective project managers are people who can take the elements, the inputs from a project, can plan them appropriately, can delegate, control the day-to-day, and keep the project going and deliver a project at the end. And it may well be that you can do that intuitively without any formal qualifications. And in fact, before things like Prince2 and the APM qualifications, people were still good project managers. These are there to help make sure you have that kind of knowledge. So if you want consistency of your organization, Prince2 helps you understand the language, the documentation that all you and the rest of your organization are actually using. Something like the APM body of knowledge would also look at that broader skills and techniques. So I would suggest for personal development, Prince2 gives you a good framework. The APM body of knowledge will give you the other things you might have a look at to be a broader skilled project manager. Effectiveness is about applying on a day-to-day basis. So good luck with that. Next question. I'm a senior manager who oversees country offices. Is it useful to do Prince 2? It depends simply, as a senior manager, on the level you're getting involved in. I would suggest if you are going to do Prince 2, you wouldn't need to be a Prince 2 practitioner. You might find the foundation is useful background knowledge. You may find the program and project sponsorship course provides sufficient information to allow you to answer those sorts of questions. It does depend on how you're getting involved. If you're going to be on a project board, essentially a project sponsor or a project executive, that may be more appropriate. There is an alternative version of the Prince 2 manual, which is just directing successful projects, which is aimed at senior managers. Without going into the detail, it looks at what you need to know as a senior manager. So there's a couple of things you can look at in terms of courses, but also there's some documentation. Again, if you look at our website, they should be able to help you with those. Where do you define your communication plan for a project? Is this in the PID, project initiation, or could you just put this in an email and agree via email? Prince 2 suggests what you have is a communication management strategy, which essentially is a communication management plan, which is who your stakeholders are and what they need to do. If you have a formal project, this is a formal document which will be part of your project initiation documentation. If you have a smaller project, it may well be that it is a couple of paragraphs in a single document, which is your PID. On a very informal project, it could be, if you have very few stakeholders, an email to those stakeholders with, this is what I intend to do, are you happy? And as long as you've got their commitment, essentially you have a plan to do so. It's the appropriateness, it depends on the circumstances when you actually do this. I've worked on a couple of projects where the email would not work and had to be formally planned. I've also worked on some very small projects. A lot of my training course development projects, we do that. We are using emails and informal documentation because the scale of the project demands an informal process. So it could be as my best answer. Country offices that run development and humanitarian projects. Okay, so if the projects are running there and have their own project boards, steering groups in the countries, then you essentially may try and pull those together often as a program. I would suggest that the detail of project and Prince 2 may be too low. I would suggest you have a look at the sponsorship course or managing successful programs. Again, perhaps only the foundation. You wouldn't be running the program, but you may well be trying to manage it at a higher level. I would suggest you look at those rather than the detail of Prince 2 if those things are happening in those individual countries. So hopefully that's a good addition to that answer. Can you share South Africa Prince 2 accredited centre? Off the top of my head, I don't know of a Prince 2 accredited organisation in South Africa. We do actually have contacts, trainers based around the world who we use as associates to run courses on behalf of us. So if you talk to us, we may be able to support that. I know a couple of my colleagues have been to South Africa and other African countries in the last 8 months or so to run courses, so we can help you with those sorts of things. So although we're UK based, we do cover worldwide. If you want to look for a local provider, then the owners of Prince 2 are Axelos, and you might try them as well. They would have a list of all of the accredited trainers worldwide. But try us first. Prince 2 is 20 years old. Is there any movement towards a Prince 3, or is current model still considered fit for use? Interestingly, Prince 2 is a best practice model. It was launched in 1996 and has been upgraded 2000, 2002, 2005, 2009. There is a project at the moment reviewing it and looking at the next upgrade. So Prince 2 remains the title, but it is a best practice model that is reviewed and maintained in line with learning across the world, essentially. So things are fed into it to keep it up to date. So the idea of Prince 2 is that it's when it incorporated the process model as well as just the themes and incorporated the principles. So they won't move to Prince 3 because that business model of principles, themes and processes is still valid. So it's not a static model. It hasn't been the same for 20 years. It is upgraded as people go. So there is a project at the moment by the owners, Axelos, to upgrade it and to bring in the latest experience from lots of different organisations about that. So to that end, 18 months ago, Prince 2 Agile which is how Prince 2 works in an agile environment, was in fact launched so that you can actually link Prince 2 to the agile development techniques that are used in both IT and non-IT projects now. So it is not a static model as they go through. I'm Prince 2 qualified and working at developing country government. One issue I face is that projects are developed after tender is awarded to private party, where private partner asks questions and then government finds solutions. How is the best way to persuade government preparation is a key. One of the things we have to talk about here is it's about maturity of the organisation, and part of this would be perhaps to look at risk. If we have a solution, if we haven't invested in investigating the kind of the problems in the first place, we're kind of just jumping towards a solution, it's almost the risk of, is this an appropriate solution? One of the things they consider in the business case is options, and this is done at both project and program level. Are we delivering the right one? And can I show this the best way forward? One of the things to think about here is what you're looking for is someone who thinks that what they're doing at the moment is not good enough. What you want is somebody in government who actually thinks there must be a better way of doing this, and what you have there is an executive or a sponsor for a change. And what they would want you to do is look at how do we do this better. So is there somebody who is dissatisfied with the current status quo? Is there somebody who finds that how things are done at the moment isn't working and has power to trigger review and alternative ways forward? That person would be a good person to drive change because it's in their interests to own that sort of change forward. And so project manager, you can then assist them in providing prompts of how we do these sorts of things. But what you need to find is someone who can say, yes, we want to do it. What I would suggest is just use bits of Prince 2 and things you're going to do. So use the templates, but simplify them. Use the structure, but simplify it so people can see how they work. If they go, I like that document, have you got anything else? Then the answer is yes. It's the introduction by staff. So there's two things you can try. High level, find a sponsor, find a driving force for this. At low level, just start using bits of it so you can actually go those sorts of things. The problem we have here is about the technical content. And that's often about maturity of the organisation, looking at how they do those sorts of things. Again, it's about having somebody who wants to change how things are done. I suspect it's not a perfect answer, but it's probably what I can do today without going into lots of detail with you individually. I don't get the concept of the owner or the sponsor. Can the author of a project also be the project manager and also the owner? When we look at projects, both in body of knowledge, kind of best practice from the Association of Project Management and Prince 2, they suggest the separation between the owner of the project, the person who makes the decision on the project, and the person who runs the day-to-day. There is an assumption that the person who triggers the project is often a senior manager. They have some authority to trigger a change in the organisation. And as such, they'll be far more expensive if they ran the day-to-day of a project. We're looking for somebody at a lower level who can then run the day-to-day and look after the detail on behalf of them. So when we look at most models for project management, there is a separation between project owner or sponsor or executive and project manager. Now, if you're looking at a single-person business, then essentially you're all those sorts of things and you're doing change because you're the person making the change, and the lines become blurred because of the nature of the organisation. So one of the things is we have the model, and it is about tailoring that particular model. So if you work in a very small organisation where it is your business, or essentially you're the single person who owns the business, and you're the person who's got to do the changes, then you are both. But it's then to separate. There are decision points where essentially you're saying, yes or no, let's go forward, and there's running the day-to-day. You may not need very much project management because it's a very informal process. You're doing all of those sorts of things. But I'd suggest that would be that kind of unique environment. Other than that, it's trying to separate the levels. It's the appropriate use of expensive resources. If you have a look at both the body of knowledge and look under sponsorship in there, or look at Prince 2, look under the role of the executive, they both explain those far better than I can do in this particular environment. But that would be the kind of thought process. Now, as a project manager, you may be the trigger of a project, but what you might need is someone to be in charge of it and essentially to be the figurehead for it. And that may be what your owner, your sponsor, is going to be. It's the figurehead for the project. while you do all the work for them. Question, can I use Prince2 templates for any of my projects? Well, the simple answer is yes. Because although Prince2 is a methodology and it will tell you, here's the documents that we're going to talk about, as long as the language fits with your organization, the people you're working with understand the language, then the templates can be used on any project, whether it's Prince2 or not. All they'll give you is a structure. It's the appropriateness. Do I want to use all of them? Do I want to combine them? I would consider how to use those. But yes, if you have a set of Prince2 templates, you can use it in your projects. PM Academy. So we have a message that says the PM Academy can assist with Prince2 in South Africa, for those of you who look at those sorts of things. Moving on. You mentioned John Cotter. Are there particular articles, books he's written which you recommend? I'm actually, a lot of the materials I pick up, it's John Cotter with a K, and he talks about 8 principles of effective change. His first article about this was from the Harvard Business Review back in 1995. He's written another book in 2001, 2002, which looks at how it works. What I've actually taken a lot of it from is a book called The Effective Change Manager's Handbook, which talks about change management, stakeholder engagement. That's published by Kogan Page and is the basis for the change management course I mentioned a couple of slides ago. So it's John Cotter with a K. And if you have a look, if you just want a kind of summary of his work, have a look at the Effective Change Manager's Handbook, published by Kogan Page, and say, we use that as the basis of the change management course, which will cover those principles as well. So that would look for John Cotter. Question, is it important to keep your Prince2 practitioner up to date, as in when your 5 years is expired, you need to do the exam again? The simple point there is, you're always going to be a Prince2 practitioner. It's the registered status that's important to us. The registered status is that the exam board, Axelos, say that because you've come back and maintained your accreditation, that you still know how to apply Prince2 in an appropriate way. If you're within an organization where, having got to that point and you're not looking for jobs outside, you may find that as long as you're doing it following your internal standards, there is no need to actually maintain that Prince2 registered practitioner status. If, however, you're a consultant or you're looking for a new job, you might find that that registered practitioner status is critical to that, and therefore you need to come back and do the re-registration exam. The re-registration is only a 1-hour exam instead of a 2.5-hour exam, so it is a smaller version. There are details on our website of how you might, what courses are available to support you going through that, if you want to look on ilexgroup.com. What is the difference between the APM and Prince2 project management courses? The Prince2 syllabus focuses on the elements I showed at the start of this webinar. So it looks at the 7 principles, 7 themes, and the process model. The APM uses the body of knowledge. Within the body of knowledge, I think there are about 60 subject areas that project managers might need to know about. And depends on which level of APM qualification you look at, depends on what's going on. The most common one is what's called the APM Project Management Qualification, or PMQ, and that covers 40 subjects out of the body of knowledge, roughly 40 subjects out of the body of knowledge. Of those 40 subjects, Prince2 is about 11 or 12 of them. So there is an overlap. The APM project courses cover far more than Prince2 tries to. If you hold Prince2 practitioner, there is a shortened version of the APM course which gives you credit for your Prince2 practitioner and allows you to fill in the other gaps, the leadership, the techniques, the other things you need to understand, health and safety, environmental concerns, the broader context. So the APM looks at that broader context of project management and covers all those things that Prince2 doesn't try to. Next question. How would you decide if you will use Prince2 or Agile for a project? Great presentation. Thank you very much for your compliments. Prince2 is a project management methodology. Agile, if you're using in projects, Agile is a product development methodology, and therefore you might use Prince2 at the top to manage and Agile at the bottom to develop. And the purpose of the Prince2 Agile was to provide a bridge between those two methodologies so that you can manage your technical work in an agile way, but still use the Prince2 methodology. Prince2 itself, as a program control system, is completely compliant with the agile development processes. and it's the agile development processes are clearly the way that work is moving towards the future, and then Prince 2, you can use that as a control system above. So your decision is do I want to build things using an agile methodology or a more traditional kind of waterfall methodology? And in both of those circumstances, you use Prince 2 above it to keep control. That's the last of our questions so far. If I give you a few more minutes, thank you very much indeed for those questions. I hope that I've managed to answer those questions to your satisfaction. If you have any more questions, please maintain contact with us via our social media. Look on our website, have a look at the details there. You can always contact us with more things. I'm getting lots of thanks, so thank you very much. If there are no more questions, thank you very much indeed for your attention. Thank you for those questions. I always find that's a really good way of finishing off a webinar. So have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend. Thank you very much indeed.